The night was thick with rain, each drop pounding against the windshield of the sleek black car that sped through the city streets. Inside, Alexander Whitman sat in silence, his piercing gray eyes gazing out into the stormy darkness. The faint hum of classical music from the car's sound system did little to ease the turmoil in his mind. The weight of his son Nathaniel's illness, a condition that had plagued the boy since the tragic loss of his mother, gnawed at his thoughts. No matter how much money he spent, how many doctors he consulted, or how many treatments he pursued, nothing seemed to help Nathaniel overcome his crippling anxiety and fear. "Sir," Thomas, his loyal driver, interrupted his reverie, his voice cautious. "There's someone in the road up ahead." Alexander frowned and leaned forward, his attention drawn to the hazy outline of two figures illuminated by the car's headlights. A young woman stood drenched in the rain, clutching a crying child. The sight was jarring, her frailty, the desperation in her posture, and the sheer vulnerability of the scene stirred something deep within him. "Stop the car," Alexander commanded, his voice firm. As the car rolled to a halt, Alexander stepped out into the cold downpour. The rain soaked through his tailored suit within seconds, but he paid no mind. The young woman turned to face him, her wide brown eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She clutched the child tightly, her lips trembling, though whether from the cold or the situation, Alexander couldn't tell. "Are you hurt?" Alexander asked, his deep voice cutting through the roar of the storm. The woman hesitated, her arms tightening protectively around the child. "No, I'm fine," she managed, her voice shaking. "But this boy, I found him alone in an alley. He's scared and cold. I didn't know what to do." Her honesty was disarming. Alexander glanced at the boy, whose small frame shivered violently. The sight struck a chord within him, a reminder of Nathaniel's own fragile state. "You can't stay out here in this weather," Alexander said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Come with me. I'll take you both somewhere safe." The young woman looked uncertain, her gaze flickering between Alexander and the sleek car behind him. Her instincts told her not to trust strangers, but the child's well-being outweighed her hesitation. After a brief pause, she nodded. "I'll come," she said quietly, shifting the boy in her arms. Alexander gestured for Thomas to open the car door, and the woman climbed in, carefully settling the child beside her. Alexander followed, his presence filling the space with an air of authority. "What's your name?" he asked as the car resumed its journey. "Ava," she replied softly. "And the boy, I don't know his name. He hasn't said a word." Alexander observed her for a moment. There was something resilient about her, despite her fragile appearance. Her soaked clothes and disheveled hair told a story of hardship, but her gaze held an unyielding determination. As the car pulled into the driveway of the Whitman estate, Ava's eyes widened at the sight of the grand mansion that loomed before her. Its towering columns and sprawling gardens were like something out of a dream or a fairy tale. "This is where I live," Alexander said, noticing her expression. "For now, you'll stay here, at least until we figure out what to do about the boy." Ava hesitated again but nodded, grateful for the warmth and shelter the mansion promised. As they stepped inside, the lavish interior was almost overwhelming. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and ornate furnishings that screamed wealth and power. "Thomas, prepare a room for our guests," Alexander instructed before turning back to Ava. "You'll find everything you need here, and if you need anything else, ask." "Thank you," Ava murmured, her voice barely audible. As she followed the housekeeper to her room, Ava couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just taken a drastic turn. She didn't know who Alexander Whitman was or why he had been so willing to help her, but one thing was certain. This encounter was only the beginning of something far greater than she could imagine. In the quiet of the night, Alexander stood by the window of his study, watching the rain cascade down the glass. His thoughts returned to Nathaniel, his son who had barely spoken a word since his mother's death. For the first time in a long while, Alexander felt a flicker of something unexpected, hope. Unbeknownst to both Alexander and Ava, their paths had crossed not by chance, but by fate. and the storm outside was only a shadow of the turbulence that was yet to come. The first rays of dawn filtered through the thick curtains of the guest room as Ava woke to the soft rustling of linens. For a brief moment, she was disoriented, unsure of where she was. The events of the night before rushed back to her. The rain, the boy she had found crying in the alley, and the stern yet strangely kind man who had brought her to his mansion. She glanced at the small figure curled up beside her on the bed. The boy, whom she now knew as Mateo, was still asleep, his tear-streaked face finally at peace. Ava's heart ached as she thought of the child's helplessness and the fear she had seen in his eyes. She had been in his shoes once, abandoned and scared, and she understood all too well the pain of feeling lost. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Ava rose cautiously and opened the door to find a tall woman with sharp features and immaculate attire standing in the hallway. "Good morning," the woman said curtly. "I'm Evelyn, the housekeeper. Mr. Whitman requests your presence in the dining room for breakfast." Ava nodded, her unease growing. She wasn't sure what to expect from Alexander Whitman. His wealth and power were intimidating, but there was something else about him, a quiet intensity that made her wary. Leaving Mateo still asleep, Ava followed Evelyn through the grand corridors of the mansion. The sheer opulence of the place was overwhelming. Rich tapestries lined the walls, and the scent of polished wood and fresh flowers filled the air. It was a world far removed from the cold streets she had called home. When she entered the dining room, Alexander was already seated at the head of the long mahogany table. His presence was commanding, his sharp suit and neatly combed hair giving him an air of authority. He looked up as she entered, his gray eyes scrutinizing her. "Good morning, Ava," he said, gesturing for her to sit. Ava hesitated before taking a seat at the far end of the table, feeling out of place amidst the lavish surroundings. Plates of food, more than she had seen in weeks, were spread across the table, but her appetite was overshadowed by her nerves. "I hope you found everything comfortable," Alexander began, his tone polite but direct. "Yes, thank you," Ava replied, her voice quiet. There was a brief silence before Alexander leaned forward, his gaze steady. "I'd like to understand more about what happened last night. You said you found the boy in an alley. Can you explain?" Ava swallowed hard, her fingers twisting in her lap. "I was walking, looking for shelter from the rain," she began. "I heard him crying and found him sitting alone. I tried to ask him where his family was, but he wouldn't say anything. I couldn't just leave him there." Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke, but she held Alexander's gaze. "You did the right thing," he said, surprising her. "But I have to ask, what were you doing out there yourself? Do you have family? Someone who might be looking for you?" Ava hesitated, her walls instinctively going up. "No," she said simply. "It's just me." Alexander studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned back in his chair. "I won't press you for details, Ava. That's your choice. But I need to be clear about one thing. I brought you here last night because I saw potential in you. My son, Nathaniel, hasn't responded to anyone in years. Therapists, teachers, even family, they've all tried and failed to help him. But he needs someone who understands fear and pain. I think you might be that person." Ava blinked, stunned by his words. "You want me to help your son?" "Yes," Alexander said without hesitation. "I'm offering you a place to stay and a chance to make a difference. Not just for yourself, but for Nathaniel." She stared at him, her mind racing. The offer was unexpected, and it came with risks. She barely knew this man or his family, and her own life was far from stable. Yet the thought of helping a child like Nathaniel, of giving him the support she had longed for as a child, tugged at her heart. "But," Ava began, her voice faltering, "I can't stay for long. I have to find someone. My brother. He's out there somewhere, and I promised I'd find him." Alexander nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I understand. You're free to leave when you feel the time is right. But for now, consider this a temporary refuge. You'll have everything you need, and in return, you'll help Nathaniel." Ava looked down at her hands, weighing her options. This wasn't what she had expected, but it felt like an opportunity she couldn't ignore. "Okay," she said finally, her voice steady. "I'll stay. For now." Alexander nodded in approval, his lips curving into a faint smile. "Good. Then let's start today." As Ava left the dining room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into something far bigger than herself. The mansion was no longer just a shelter. It was the beginning of a journey that would test her in ways she had never imagined. The Whitman mansion, grand and imposing, was a world unto itself. Every corner seemed to whisper of wealth, power, and history. For Ava, it was overwhelming, a stark contrast to the alleys and shelters she was used to. As she walked the halls with Evelyn, the housekeeper, she couldn't help but feel like an outsider in a place that seemed designed to intimidate. Evelyn led her to Nathaniel's room, a large, sunlit space that overlooked the expansive gardens. The room was tastefully decorated with soft blues and whites, giving it a calming atmosphere. Nathaniel sat by the window, his small frame dwarfed by the armchair he was curled up in. His blonde hair fell over his pale face, and his eyes were fixed on the trees swaying in the wind outside. "Nathaniel," Evelyn said, her tone soft but formal. "This is Ava. She's here to spend some time with you." Nathaniel didn't respond. His silence was heavy, a wall that Ava recognized all too well. She gave him a small, warm smile. "Hi, Nathaniel," she said gently. "I'm Ava. I'm here to keep you company." He glanced at her briefly, his expression wary, before turning his gaze back to the window. Evelyn sighed quietly and stepped back, leaving Ava alone with the boy. Ava moved slowly, careful not to startle him. She knelt beside the armchair, keeping her voice soft and steady. "I used to love watching trees in the wind," she said, her tone conversational. "They reminded me that even when things get stormy, they stand tall. Kind of like us, don't you think?" Nathaniel didn't respond, but his hand twitched slightly on the armrest. It was a small reaction, but Ava took it as a sign that he was listening. She decided not to push further and instead sat nearby, giving him space while she quietly observed him. As the day went on, Ava tried different ways to engage Nathaniel, from reading aloud to suggesting they draw together. He remained distant, but she could see flickers of curiosity in his eyes. Slowly, she began to understand that his silence wasn't just about fear. It was his way of protecting himself from a world that had hurt him. That evening, as Ava settled into her temporary role in the Whitman household, she encountered Adriana. The woman's presence was as striking as it was unsettling. Dressed impeccably in a tailored dress and heels, Adriana exuded confidence and control. Her sharp blue eyes swept over Ava with thinly veiled disdain as they crossed paths in the hallway. "So, you're the one Alexander brought home," Adriana said, her tone clipped and cold. Ava hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Yes, I'm Ava," she said finally, extending a polite smile. Adriana's lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I see. Well, let me make one thing clear. Alexander is a kind man. Too kind, sometimes, but don't mistake his generosity for anything more. You're here to help Nathaniel, nothing else. Stay in your place, and we won't have any problems." The words stung, but Ava maintained her composure. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice steady. Adriana didn't reply, simply turning on her heel and walking away, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Ava exhaled slowly, the encounter leaving her feeling more isolated than ever. Despite the tension, Ava focused on Nathaniel. Over the next few days, she continued to spend time with him, finding small ways to connect. She noticed that he seemed to relax when she hummed softly, a simple, soothing tune she had learned as a child. Though he still didn't speak, he began to allow her closer, letting her sit beside him as he drew in his sketchpad. One evening, as Ava tucked Nathaniel into bed, Alexander appeared at the door. He watched silently for a moment as she smoothed the blankets over the boy, her gentle care evident in every movement. "You're good with him," Alexander said once they were outside the room. Ava turned to face him, surprised by the compliment. "Thank you," she said. "He's a wonderful child. He just needs time." Alexander nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've spent years trying to help him, but nothing seems to work. Maybe you're what he needs." Ava wasn't sure how to respond. She felt the weight of his words, the pressure of the role she had taken on. But she also felt a deep sense of purpose, a chance to make a difference, even in a place where she felt like she didn't belong. As she walked back to her room that night, Ava's thoughts were a mixture of hope and uncertainty. The mansion was beautiful, but its walls held secrets and tensions that she didn't fully understand. And as much as she wanted to help Nathaniel, she couldn't shake the feeling that her presence here had disrupted something far larger than herself. Unbeknownst to her, the storm brewing within the Whitman household was only just beginning. The days turned into a routine for Ava, but routine didn't mean ease. Every morning, she would rise early to check on Nathaniel, greeting him with a soft "good morning" that he didn't always respond to. Slowly but surely, though, she saw tiny signs of progress. He would allow her to sit closer, would nod faintly when she asked simple questions, and occasionally he would even make eye contact. Despite these small victories, the atmosphere in the mansion remained tense. The staff, led by the ever-watchful Evelyn, treated Ava with a mixture of cold politeness and veiled skepticism. Whispers trailed behind her in the hallways, and every glance she received seemed to carry unspoken questions. Who is she? Why is she here? Ava didn't let it bother her, not visibly at least. She had endured far worse in her life than disapproving stares. Her focus was on Nathaniel, and she reminded herself that his well-being was more important than her comfort. But Adriana was a different matter entirely. The woman's animosity toward Ava seemed to grow with each passing day. It wasn't just the icy stares or the pointed remarks. It was the subtle ways she tried to undermine Ava's presence. Adriana would hover near Nathaniel's room, questioning Ava's every decision and subtly implying that she was overstepping her boundaries. One afternoon, as Ava sat with Nathaniel on the floor of his room, helping him piece together a puzzle, Adriana entered without knocking. "Nathaniel, darling," Adriana said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Why don't you let me help you with that? Ava must be tired." Nathaniel stiffened at the sound of her voice, his small hands gripping a puzzle piece tightly. Ava glanced at him, sensing his discomfort, and spoke gently. "It's okay, Nathaniel. We're almost done here," she said, keeping her tone light. Adriana's smile tightened. "I think I know what's best for him," she said, her gaze hardening as it shifted to Ava. Before Ava could respond, Nathaniel suddenly got up and moved to the other side of the room, taking the puzzle box with him. His message was clear. He didn't want Adriana's help. Adriana's face darkened, but she quickly masked her frustration. "He's a sensitive boy," she said, addressing Ava as though she weren't in the room. "You'll need to learn how to handle him properly." Ava met Adriana's gaze, her voice calm but firm. "I think Nathaniel is doing just fine." The tension between them hung thick in the air, but Adriana didn't respond. She left the room in silence, her heels clicking sharply against the floor as she walked away. That evening, as Ava helped Nathaniel get ready for bed, she couldn't stop thinking about the moment. Adriana's attempts to assert control over Nathaniel felt less like genuine concern and more like a power play. It was clear to Ava that the woman wasn't as interested in Nathaniel's well-being as she claimed to be. Later that night, Ava found herself in the kitchen, preparing a cup of tea to calm her nerves. She was surprised when Alexander walked in, his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened. "You're still awake," he remarked, noticing her. Ava offered a small smile. "Couldn't sleep," she admitted. Alexander nodded and poured himself a glass of water. For a moment, they stood in silence, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the room. "How's Nathaniel?" he asked finally. "He's doing better," Ava said, her voice softening. "He's opening up little by little. It'll take time, but I think he'll get there." Alexander studied her, his expression thoughtful. "You've been good for him," he said. "Better than I expected." Ava wasn't sure how to respond to that. She sipped her tea, the warmth soothing her frayed nerves. I know it's not easy being here, Alexander continued, his voice quieter. The staff, Adriana, they're not always welcoming. But I need you to stay focused on Nathaniel. He needs someone like you in his life right now. I will, Ava promised, her tone resolute. Alexander gave her a brief nod before leaving the kitchen. Ava watched him go, her thoughts swirling. His words were meant to reassure her, but they also served as a reminder of the delicate balance she was trying to maintain in the mansion. The following days brought more challenges. Evelyn's cool demeanor remained unchanged, and the other staff began to echo her unspoken disapproval. The housekeeper, Marina, was particularly vocal, often making snide remarks about Ava's lack of experience or questioning her motives. Not everyone gets to waltz into a place like this, Marina said one morning as Ava passed her in the hallway. You should count yourself lucky, girl. Ava bit her tongue, refusing to rise to the bait. She reminded herself that she was here for Nathaniel, not for the approval of the staff. Despite the hostility, Ava found solace in her growing bond with Nathaniel. One evening, as they sat together on the floor of his room, he surprised her by reaching out to hand her a crayon. Draw, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Ava's heart swelled at the sound of his voice. It was the first word he had spoken to her since she arrived. She took the crayon with a smile, keeping her emotions in check as she began to draw alongside him. In that moment, the tension and hostility of the mansion faded away. It was just Ava and Nathaniel, two souls finding comfort in each other's presence. But even as Ava found hope in her bond with Nathaniel, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fragile peace she had managed to build in the mansion was on the verge of being shattered. The mansion's air, already heavy with unspoken conflicts, grew even tenser as Adriana's resentment toward Ava deepened. Adriana had always been accustomed to controlling her surroundings, especially within the Whitman estate. Ava's presence, unpolished, unexpected, and far too comfortable in Nathaniel's world, felt like a threat she couldn't ignore. One crisp morning, Adriana made her move. She entered Alexander's study, a space he guarded zealously as his sanctuary, and leaned casually against his desk. Alexander glanced up from his laptop, immediately sensing the purpose behind her visit. We need to talk, Adriana began, her voice smooth but edged with intent. About? Alexander asked, leaning back in his chair. Adriana folded her arms, feigning concern. Ava, she said, letting the name hang in the air like an accusation. Don't you think it's strange how quickly she's settled in here? She's practically taken over Nathaniel's care, and no one knows anything about her background. Alexander's jaw tightened. Ava is here because she's helping Nathaniel. That's all that matters to me. Adriana let out a soft, dismissive laugh. You're too trusting, Alex. For all we know, she could be taking advantage of your kindness or worse. Don't you think it's irresponsible to have someone like her so close to Nathaniel without knowing her full story? Alexander's eyes narrowed. What exactly are you suggesting? I'm saying we need to be cautious, Adriana pressed, her tone more insistent. For Nathaniel's sake, just keep an eye on her. You don't have to confront her directly, but we can't afford to take risks. Alexander didn't respond immediately, but her words lingered. As much as he disliked admitting it, doubt began to creep into his thoughts. He had taken Ava in on instinct, but was it possible he had been too hasty? That evening, Alexander's unease grew as he watched Ava and Nathaniel from the hallway. She was sitting on the floor with his son, her voice soft as she read aloud from a storybook. Nathaniel leaned against her shoulder, his usually guarded face calm and relaxed. It was a sight that should have filled Alexander with relief, but instead, Adriana's words echoed in his mind. Determined to err on the side of caution, Alexander made a decision. He retrieved a small, discreet camera from a drawer in his study. It wasn't a drastic move, he told himself. It was simply a precaution, a way to ensure that Nathaniel was safe. Later that night, after Nathaniel had fallen asleep, Alexander entered the boys' room under the pretense of checking the window locks. While there, he carefully placed the camera on a high bookshelf, ensuring it was hidden among Nathaniel's collection of toys and trinkets. The following days passed uneventfully, but Alexander couldn't stop himself from reviewing the footage late at night. He told himself it wasn't about distrust, it was about protecting his son. What he saw in the recordings surprised him. Ava's interactions with Nathaniel were nothing short of genuine. She approached him with patience and understanding, never pushing him beyond his comfort zone. Her voice was soft and calming as she read to him, and her presence seemed to soothe him in a way no one else could. Yet, Alexander couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to her story. He began to notice subtle details. The way Ava would glance at the windows as if expecting someone to appear, or how her hands occasionally trembled when she thought no one was watching. It was clear she carried a weight, a secret she wasn't sharing. Meanwhile, Adriana's suspicions didn't wane. She enlisted Marina, the housekeeper, to subtly monitor Ava's activities. Marina, ever loyal to Adriana, began planting seeds of doubt among the other staff. "She's hiding something," Marina whispered to Evelyn one afternoon. "You can tell by the way she avoids certain questions. Mark my words, we'll find out the truth soon enough." The whispers reached Ava's ears, but she chose to ignore them. She had faced far worse judgment in her life and wasn't about to let gossip deter her from helping Nathaniel. Still, she couldn't deny the growing hostility around her, and it left her feeling increasingly isolated. One evening, as Ava finished cleaning up after dinner, she overheard Marina speaking in hushed tones with Adriana near the pantry. "She's too comfortable here," Marina said. "I've been watching her. There's something not right about her story." "Keep digging," Adriana replied coldly. "I want to know everything. Where she came from, why she's really here. We'll see how long Alexander's faith in her lasts." Ava's heart sank as she realized the extent of their efforts to discredit her. She retreated to her room, determined to remain focused on Nathaniel despite the mounting opposition. But the storm brewing in the mansion was far from over. Unbeknownst to Ava, the very camera Alexander had installed to protect his son would soon reveal truths that would change everything, for better or worse. Alexander's late-night ritual of reviewing the camera footage had become a habit, one he didn't enjoy but felt was necessary. Night after night, he sat in his study, watching the grainy videos on his laptop. At first, it seemed there was nothing unusual about Ava's behavior. If anything, the recordings reinforced what he already suspected. Ava was kind, attentive, and patient with Nathaniel. Yet, as the days passed, Alexander found himself scrutinizing her every move. Was there something she was hiding in her quiet moments? The way she sometimes gazed out the window for long stretches of time struck him as odd. Was it longing, fear, or something else entirely? One particular night, he stumbled upon a recording that made him pause. It was from the previous evening, after Nathaniel had fallen asleep. Ava sat beside his bed, softly humming a tune. She reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from Nathaniel's forehead. "I know you're scared, little one," she whispered, "but you're not alone. I won't let anything hurt you." Her words were tender, but her voice carried an undercurrent of pain, as though she wasn't just speaking to Nathaniel but also to herself. Alexander leaned back in his chair, troubled. Who was Ava protecting Nathaniel from? And what was she running from herself? Meanwhile, Ava's days in the mansion continued with growing challenges. The whispers from the staff became louder, and the subtle hostility began to escalate into outright sabotage. She'd find her cleaning supplies mysteriously misplaced or Nathaniel's favorite toys hidden, creating small obstacles that disrupted their routine. One morning, as she prepared Nathaniel's breakfast, she noticed Adriana watching her from the kitchen doorway. "You're up early," Adriana remarked, her tone sharp. "I usually am," Ava replied evenly, keeping her focus on the task at hand. Adriana walked closer, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "You're very dedicated," she said, her words laced with suspicion. "But dedication doesn't always mean trustworthiness." Ava set the spoon down and met Adriana's gaze. "Nathaniel trusts me, and that's what matters." Adriana's smile didn't reach her eyes. "For now," she said before turning and leaving the room. Ava's hands trembled as she finished preparing breakfast. It was clear that Adriana wouldn't stop until she found a way to push her out of the mansion. Later that evening, as Alexander reviewed the latest footage, he noticed something unusual. Ava was speaking to Nathaniel in his room, her voice calm and soothing as always. But when Nathaniel fell asleep, Ava moved to the window and looked outside. "What are you afraid of?" Alexander murmured to himself as he watched her. A sudden knock on his study door startled him. "Come in," he said, closing the laptop quickly. It was Evelyn, the head of the staff. Her expression was tense as she stepped into the room. "Mr. Whitman," she began, her voice measured, "I thought you should know. There have been concerns about Ava." Alexander frowned. "Concerns? From whom?" "The staff," Evelyn admitted. "And Miss Adriana. They believe she might not be who she says she is. I've tried to maintain professionalism, but there's talk of missing items and inconsistencies in her story." Alexander's patience was wearing thin. "Have you seen any proof of these accusations?" Evelyn hesitated, then shook her head. "No, sir. But with all due respect, I think it's worth investigating further. For the family's safety." Alexander dismissed her with a curt nod, his thoughts swirling. The following night, as he reviewed more footage, Alexander noticed something new. Ava was seated on the floor with Nathaniel, playing with a set of building blocks. She laughed softly at something Nathaniel did, and for the first time in years, Alexander heard his son laugh back. It was faint, almost hesitant, but it was unmistakable. Nathaniel laughed. Alexander's heart swelled with emotion, but it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of the situation. Adriana, Evelyn, and the staff's suspicions were not going away, and his own doubts lingered. In the quiet of his study, Alexander leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Ava was a mystery, but she was also the first person to break through Nathaniel's walls. Whatever her past held, Alexander couldn't ignore the positive impact she had on his son. But he also couldn't ignore the feeling that her presence was tied to something far larger and more dangerous than any of them realized. The camera, meant to reassure him, was beginning to raise more questions than answers. And Alexander knew that the peace within the mansion was more fragile than ever. The days that followed were a slow burn of tension, the air thick with secrets and suspicion. Ava continued to care for Nathaniel, her presence a comforting constant in the mansion, but the walls seemed to close in around her. The staff's hostility was more palpable now, with every interaction dripping with passive aggression. Even Nathaniel, who had once been her sole ally, seemed to withdraw when the others were around, as if the weight of their suspicion had begun to seep into him too. One afternoon, Alexander was seated in his study when he overheard a conversation between Adriana and the housekeeper, Marina. The voices were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable, a mixture of secrecy and distrust. He had been trying to maintain some distance from the growing tension, but it was becoming harder to ignore the whispers that followed him through the halls. "Have you noticed how often she disappears?" Adriana asked, her voice laced with frustration. "Ava, she's always sneaking off somewhere, and I can't help but wonder what she's really up to." "I've seen it," Marina replied. "She's always looking over her shoulder, like she's afraid someone's watching her. I've been paying attention. The way she talks to Nathaniel is strange. And then there's that look in her eyes, like she's hiding something." "Exactly. I don't trust her, Marina. We need to find out who she really is. And if she's hiding something, we need to expose it before she does any more damage." "Don't worry, Miss Adriana. I've been keeping an eye on her. I'll find out what she's hiding. I always do." The conversation sent a chill down Alexander's spine. His instincts had been telling him for days that something wasn't right, but hearing Adriana and Marina's suspicions voiced so openly made it feel like the noose was tightening. As he moved to confront Adriana, Alexander hesitated. Could he trust her? Could he trust anyone in the house anymore? His growing doubts about Ava were mirrored by his increasing mistrust of those around him. But one thing was certain. Nathaniel's well-being came first. He needed to find the truth. That evening, he decided to take matters into his own hands. As the house settled into its usual quiet after dinner, Alexander found himself standing in front of Nathaniel's door, staring at the camera he had hidden there days ago. The footage from the previous night showed something disturbing. Ava had stood by Nathaniel's bedside for much longer than usual. She wasn't speaking to him, just staring out the window. Her eyes were filled with a deep sorrow, and Alexander could see the faintest tremble in her hands. But what struck him the most was the reflection in the window. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was hard to make out, but it was unmistakable. Someone had been watching Ava. Someone who didn't belong. A cold shiver ran down his spine. His worst fears were becoming a reality. The next day, Alexander confronted Ava. He found her in the garden, tending to a row of flowers that had been Nathaniel's mother's favorite. The gentle afternoon sunlight bathed her in a soft glow, and for a moment, Alexander almost forgot the urgency that weighed on him. "Ava," he began, his voice steady but tense. "We need to talk." Ava stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands. She looked at him, a mixture of apprehension and resignation in her gaze. "About what, Mr. Whitman?" Alexander didn't waste time. "I've been watching the cameras." Ava's face paled, and her lips parted as if to say something, but she quickly closed them again. "I know you've been hiding something," Alexander continued, his voice hardening. "I saw the reflection in the window. Someone was watching you. I need you to tell me the truth." "Ava. Who were they?" Ava's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. She had been caught, and the weight of the lie she had carried for so long finally broke through her calm facade. I didn't mean for this to happen," she said softly, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think. I never wanted to bring anyone here. I thought I could protect Nathaniel. I thought I could protect everyone." Alexander took a step closer, his gaze narrowing. "Who were they?" Ava closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. "My brother," she whispered. "Gabriel. He's the one watching me. He's the reason I'm here." The revelation hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. Her brother? The man who had been stalking her for so long, the shadow that lingered in the corners of her life, had somehow found his way into the mansion. "Why?" Alexander asked, his voice low with a mix of disbelief and concern. "Why didn't you tell me?" Ava looked down, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. "I didn't want anyone to know. Gabriel, he's not the same person I once knew. He's been in and out of trouble for years. I had to leave him behind when I started looking for work. I had to protect Nathaniel, but Gabriel found me anyway. I didn't know what else to do." Alexander's mind raced as he processed the information. Ava's past had been a tangled web of pain and sacrifice, but it was clear that she was trying to shield Nathaniel from the very thing that had haunted her. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his emotions. "You should have told me, Ava. You should have trusted me." Ava nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Alexander paused, his thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. His protective instincts screamed at him to shut Ava out, to distance himself from the danger she had brought into their lives. But a deeper part of him, one that had grown to care for Ava, for Nathaniel's sake, fought against it. "We need to deal with this," he said finally, his voice calm but resolute. "We'll figure this out together. But you have to trust me from now on." Ava met his gaze, a mixture of fear and hope in her eyes. "I do trust you. I didn't know how to ask for help." As they stood there in the garden, the weight of their conversation hanging heavily between them, Alexander knew that everything was about to change. The mystery of Ava's past had been uncovered, but it was just the beginning, and the truth would have consequences, both for her and for the Whitman family. The air in the garden felt heavy as Ava and Alexander stood in silence, the weight of her confession settling between them. Alexander had no idea how to process the revelation. Ava's brother, Gabriel, had been stalking her, and the danger he posed was now far too close for comfort. It was clear that Ava had been hiding a painful truth, one that had haunted her for years. Ava's voice broke the silence, barely a whisper. I never wanted you to know. I was trying to build a life here for Nathaniel. I thought if I could just keep him safe and help him, maybe my past would stay buried. But Gabriel found me. He always does. Alexander's expression softened. His protective instinct was still strong, but he could see the struggle in Ava's eyes. She wasn't the enemy. She was just a woman trying to protect herself and the child she'd come to care for. He stepped closer, his voice gentler. You've been through a lot, haven't you? Ava nodded, wiping away a tear that had fallen. She took a deep breath and looked up at him. My family was never what it seemed. I grew up in a neighborhood where survival was everything. My parents, they were good people, but they couldn't protect us from the world. When I was old enough, I left to make a better life for myself. But Gabriel, she hesitated, her voice faltering. He didn't. He got mixed up in things he couldn't get out of. He's angry, so angry at me for leaving, for trying to be better. Alexander listened intently, his mind racing. The more he heard, the more he realized that Ava wasn't just running from her brother. She was running from a lifetime of pain, guilt, and impossible choices. Her journey to this point hadn't been easy, and it was clear that the fear of losing Nathaniel had driven her to conceal the truth from him. Why didn't you tell me about Gabriel? Alexander asked, his voice a little softer, but still tinged with concern. I couldn't, Ava replied, shaking her head. I thought if I told you, you'd send me away. I thought if I just kept my distance, kept everything under control, I could keep Nathaniel safe. But now I see I've made everything worse. Alexander's mind was reeling, but he was also seeing the situation through new eyes. Ava wasn't just some mysterious woman in his house. She was a person with a history, a past that had shaped her decisions and her actions. The fear she had carried had been buried deep, and only now, after everything that had happened, was it finally coming to light. I'm not going to send you away, Ava, Alexander said firmly, meeting her gaze. But you have to understand, we need to handle this together. Gabriel isn't just a shadow in your past anymore. He's a threat to this family. We need to take action. We can't let him keep terrorizing you or Nathaniel. Ava looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of relief and terror. She wasn't sure if she could trust him fully yet, but hearing those words, we need to handle this together, was the first sign of real hope she had felt in a long time. Thank you, she whispered, her voice shaky. Just as they were about to continue their conversation, a figure appeared at the gate of the garden. It was Gabriel. He stood there, tall and imposing, his eyes cold and calculating. Ava's heart sank at the sight of him. Get away from her, Gabriel, Alexander said, his voice cold with authority as he stepped in front of Ava, instinctively shielding her from him. Gabriel's lip curled into a smirk. So you figured it out, huh? You think you can just hide her away and pretend nothing's wrong? He laughed bitterly, his eyes flashing with rage. She's mine, Whitman. You think you can protect her? You have no idea what you're dealing with. Ava stepped forward, trembling but trying to muster whatever strength she had left. Gabriel, please. This isn't the way. I just want a life away from all of this. I want to protect Nathaniel. Let it go. Gabriel took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. You think you can just leave everything behind, huh? You think you're better than me now? You're nothing, Ava. You always were nothing. The words cut deep, but Ava didn't flinch. She stood tall, her gaze unwavering. You're wrong, Gabriel. I'm not running from you anymore. I'm not running from anyone. And I'm not afraid of you anymore. Alexander stood next to Ava, his presence firm and unwavering. Enough, Gabriel. If you want to make a threat, do it somewhere else. This isn't the time, and it's not the place. Gabriel's eyes flashed with anger, but something in Alexander's voice made him hesitate. This isn't over, Ava. I'll be back. He spat, his voice laced with venom before turning and storming off. Ava stood there, frozen, her body shaking with the adrenaline that had surged through her. But when she looked at Alexander, something shifted in her. He hadn't backed down. He hadn't been afraid of her brother. He had stood by her. I won't let him hurt you, Alexander said, his voice steady and comforting. Ava's heart pounded in her chest. She had never felt safer than she did in that moment, standing beside him. Despite the chaos that had erupted, she realized something. She wasn't alone anymore. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "You don't have to," Alexander replied, his gaze steady. "But we need to figure out what to do next. Gabriel won't stop until he gets what he wants. We have to be ready." The weight of the situation settled on them both. Ava's past was no longer a secret, and Gabriel's presence was no longer an unseen threat. But now they had a choice: to face it together or to let it tear them apart. For the first time, Ava wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain: she wasn't facing it alone. The next morning, the atmosphere in the Whitman mansion was thick with tension. Ava had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of her brother, Gabriel, and the confrontation that was still fresh in her memory. Though she felt safer with Alexander by her side, the fear of what Gabriel might do next weighed heavily on her. The reality of the situation had set in. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Nathaniel, about protecting him from the consequences of a past that kept resurfacing in painful ways. Alexander, too, was on edge. Gabriel's threats were far from idle. It was clear that he had no intention of letting Ava go. Alexander couldn't shake the image of Gabriel's cold, calculating eyes and the anger that had dripped from every word he spoke. He knew that this was just the beginning, that Gabriel would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. "I can't let him tear this family apart," Alexander muttered to himself as he paced in his study. He had made his decision. The time to confront Gabriel and end the cycle of fear and manipulation had come. Ava had been hesitant when Alexander suggested they go find Gabriel, but in the end, she knew it was the only way to stop him for good. There was no more running, no more hiding. If she was going to protect Nathaniel and her newfound life, she would have to face her brother and confront the truth of her past once and for all. The drive to the rundown neighborhood where Gabriel was believed to be living was silent, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The tension in the air was palpable, and neither of them spoke as the cityscape transformed into a more neglected, poverty-stricken area. The houses here were dilapidated, many of them abandoned or in desperate need of repair. It was a far cry from the wealth and privilege Ava had come to experience in the Whitman mansion. As they pulled up to a crumbling building, Ava's heart sank. This was the place where Gabriel had made his home, a place she had never wanted to revisit. It felt like a ghost of her past, one she had fought so hard to escape. "I'll go in with you," Alexander said quietly, placing a hand on Ava's arm to steady her. "We don't know what we're walking into." Ava nodded, though her nerves were raw. She had no idea what Gabriel would be like now, whether the years of separation had changed him or hardened him further. He had always been volatile, unpredictable, and the man she remembered was nothing like the brother she had once hoped would find peace. Together, they stepped out of the car and walked toward the house. The door was ajar, and there was no sign of life except for the faint smell of something foul drifting through the air. Ava's stomach turned as memories of her childhood resurfaced. Memories of chaos, of violence, of running away from the constant fear of being trapped in this very place. "Gabriel," Ava called out softly, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. "It's me, Ava. I'm here to talk." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, and then a figure appeared in the doorway, a shadow that slowly solidified into the face of Gabriel. He was taller now, his features sharp and hardened, but his eyes, they were the same. Cold, angry, empty. "Ava," he said, his voice low and rough. He stepped forward, his eyes scanning her with a mix of disbelief and contempt. "You think you can just walk away from me? You think you can live this perfect little life while I'm left here, forgotten?" "I never wanted to leave you, Gabriel," Ava said, her voice breaking. "But I couldn't stay. You were destroying everything around you, and I couldn't watch it anymore. I thought if I left, maybe I could give us both a chance at something better." Gabriel's lips curled into a bitter smile, but there was no warmth in it. "You were always better than me, Ava, always thinking you could escape. But you're wrong. You can't escape me. You never could. Ava took a step back, her chest tight with the weight of his words. I'm not trying to escape you anymore, Gabriel. I'm here now. I want to help you. I want us to fix things, to make things right. Gabriel let out a harsh laugh. Help me? He scoffed. You think I need your help? I don't need anything from you, Ava. I've been fine on my own. It's you who's been running from me, from the truth. His voice dropped to a menacing tone. You think I don't know what you're hiding? You think I don't see what you're trying to protect? Alexander stepped forward, his presence strong and unwavering. That's enough, Gabriel. This ends now. Gabriel turned his gaze on Alexander, sizing him up with a sneer. And who the hell are you? The great protector. Huh? You think you can just waltz in here and play the hero? I'm here to make sure nothing happens to Ava, Alexander said calmly, his eyes steady. And nothing happens to Nathaniel. Whatever you're planning, it's over. Gabriel's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing dangerously. You think you can stop me? You're nothing. Just another man who thinks he can control everything. But you don't know me. You don't know what I'm capable of. The air between them crackled with tension, and for a moment, Ava thought it might all come to a head right there. But then something shifted in Gabriel's gaze. For the briefest of moments, his anger faltered, replaced by something softer, almost regretful. I'm not the person you think I am, Ava, he said, his voice quieter, almost broken. I never wanted this for us, but I couldn't change. I couldn't stop. Ava's heart wrenched as she saw the cracks in Gabriel's facade. She had always hoped that the brother she once knew, the boy full of potential, would someday return. But years of pain, anger, and bad decisions had twisted him into someone unrecognizable. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I wanted to save you, Gabriel, but I can't do it alone anymore. You have to want it, too. You have to want to change. Gabriel turned away, his back stiff and his shoulders hunched as if the weight of her words was too much to bear. I don't know how to change, he muttered, almost to himself. I don't know how to fix any of it. Ava took a step toward him, her hand reaching out tentatively. You don't have to do it alone. I'm here. We can figure it out together. But Gabriel was already walking away, disappearing into the shadows of the rundown house. Ava stood there, her heart heavy with a mixture of hope and sorrow. She had come here to confront the past, to find a way to bring her brother back into her life. But she knew now that it wasn't going to be that simple. As they turned to leave, Alexander's hand brushed against hers, a silent promise that they would face whatever came next together. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least they had each other. And for the first time in a long time, Ava felt like maybe, just maybe, there was hope for a future beyond the scars of her past. The drive back from Gabriel's house was silent, the weight of the encounter hanging heavily in the air. Ava's mind was a tangled mess of conflicting emotions: guilt, anger, hope, and sorrow. She had confronted Gabriel, but it felt like nothing had changed. She had hoped to find the brother she once knew, but instead, she was faced with a stranger, a man consumed by bitterness and resentment. As the mansion loomed in the distance, Ava couldn't help but wonder if she had made a mistake by coming back into Gabriel's life. Could she really save him? Was it even worth it? But one thing was certain: she could no longer keep running from the past. Gabriel would always be a part of her, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't change that. Back at the mansion, things were tense. The staff's cold behavior toward Ava had only grown more pronounced since her return. Adriana, in particular, had become increasingly hostile, her jealousy simmering just beneath the surface. Ava could feel her eyes on her whenever they were in the same room, but she tried to ignore it, focusing instead on her primary goal: keeping Nathaniel safe and helping him heal. But things were about to take a darker turn. That evening, as Ava prepared to settle down for the night, she received a message from Alexander. He wanted to meet her in his office. When she entered, she found him standing by the window, his expression grim. Ava, we need to talk, he said, his voice tight with concern. I've been keeping an eye on things, And there's something I need to show you. Ava's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what he was talking about, but the look on his face told her it wasn't good. She sat down across from him, her stomach churning with unease. I've been getting reports from the staff, Alexander continued, pacing as he spoke. They've been acting strange, more distant than usual. And then there's Adriana. She's been making accusations about you. I think she's trying to manipulate me. Ava's breath caught in her throat. Adriana. She should have known. She had always suspected that Adriana wasn't as friendly as she pretended to be, but she never imagined things would go this far. What kind of accusations? Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She's telling the staff that you've been stealing from the house, hiding things in your room, and that you've been up to something behind my back, Alexander said, his eyes narrowing. She's trying to paint you as a thief, Ava. Ava felt a cold rage bubbling up inside her. How could Adriana be so petty, so deceitful? She had been nothing but kind to her, and this was how she repaid her? But what was even worse was the fact that Adriana was trying to turn Alexander against her. I don't know why she's doing this, Alexander said, running a hand through his hair, but I'm starting to worry that she's playing a much bigger game than I realized. Ava stood up, her hands clenched into fists. I won't let her destroy everything I've worked for. I won't let her tear us apart. Alexander's eyes softened as he reached for her hand. I'm not going to let her either, but we need to be careful. If she's really trying to turn the staff against you, we might have bigger problems than we thought. Ava nodded, her mind racing. She couldn't afford to let Adriana win. But at the same time, she knew that she couldn't fight this battle alone. She had to outsmart her, to play the game just as ruthlessly as Adriana was doing. I think I have an idea, Ava said, a dangerous glint in her eyes. But I need you to trust me. Alexander didn't hesitate. You have my trust, Ava. Always. Ava took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had been thrust into a war she never asked for, but now she was ready to fight back. It was time to expose Adriana for what she truly was, to make sure she could never hurt them again. The next morning, things began to unfold quickly. Ava had set her plan in motion. She knew that if Adriana was going to accuse her of stealing, she needed to make it clear that the real thief was someone else. She had noticed Marina's strange behavior over the past few weeks, how she had been sneaking around the house, always looking over her shoulder, always trying to avoid the other staff members. Ava had seen through her act from the beginning. Marina had been hiding something, and Ava was going to find out what. She spent the day watching Marina carefully, following her movements throughout the mansion. It wasn't long before she caught her in the act. Marina had been going through the cabinets in the kitchen, slipping something into her bag. Ava's pulse quickened as she realized what was happening. Marina was stealing from the Whitman family, and she had been doing it for months. Ava knew this was her chance. She couldn't let Marina frame her for crimes she hadn't committed. She had to act fast. That evening, as Alexander prepared for dinner, Ava pulled him aside and showed him what she had found. Marina's stolen goods were hidden in her bag, the evidence undeniable. We need to confront her now, Alexander said, his voice low and dangerous. Together, they went to the staff quarters, where Marina was finishing her shift. Ava could feel the tension building in her chest as they approached her room. When they knocked, Marina opened the door, her face instantly falling when she saw them. What do you want? She asked, her voice trembling. Ava stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. We know what you've been doing, Marina. You've been stealing from the house, and we have proof. Marina's face turned pale, and for a moment, it looked as though she might crumble. But then, something in her snapped. She lunged forward, trying to push past them, but Alexander grabbed her by the arm, holding her firmly in place. You're done, Marina, he said coldly. You're going to leave this house, and you're going to leave now. Marina's eyes blazed with fury. You can't do this. I've been loyal to you, to the family. You'll regret this. But Alexander was resolute. No, Marina. You've been manipulating everyone. You're done. With one final glare, Marina was escorted out of the mansion, her presence no longer tolerated. Ava felt a strange mix of relief and satisfaction. The betrayal she had feared was now over, and with Marina gone, she could finally breathe. But as the door slammed shut behind her, Ava knew that the battle was far from over. There were still many challenges ahead, and Adriana would stop at nothing to destroy her. But for the first time, Ava felt like she had the upper hand, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The air in the mansion was thick with anticipation. With Marina's expulsion, things should have calmed down, but the storm wasn't over yet. Ava knew that while they had eliminated one threat, Adriana's manipulation was far from finished. The accusation of theft was still looming over her head, and if she couldn't prove Marina's deceit, everything she had worked for could come crumbling down. The confrontation with Marina had been only the beginning. Adriana had managed to turn the entire staff against Ava, spreading lies and rumors about her every move. But Ava wasn't going to back down, not this time. She had the evidence that could shatter Adriana's plan, and she wasn't afraid to use it. The next few days were a blur of legal preparations. Alexander had hired the best lawyers, and they worked tirelessly to ensure that they would be ready for whatever Adriana threw their way in court. Ava, on the other hand, spent her time gathering the final pieces of evidence. She knew that the truth was on her side, but that didn't mean Adriana would back down easily. The day of the trial arrived, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Ava sat at the defendant's table beside Alexander, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The room was filled with a sense of foreboding, the weight of the accusations hanging in the air. Across from them sat Adriana, her icy gaze fixed on Ava, a smug smile playing at the corners of her lips. She looked as though she was already certain of her victory. Ava tried to keep her composure, but her nerves were frayed. She had never imagined she would find herself in a courtroom, fighting for her future. But here she was, facing down the woman who had made her life a living hell. Adriana's voice rang out as she made her opening statement, painting Ava as a thief and a liar. She claimed that Ava had been sneaking around the house, hiding valuables in her room, and that her presence was nothing more than a ruse to steal from the Whitman family. Ava's heart pounded in her chest as the accusations flew. It felt as though the walls were closing in on her, and for a moment, she wondered if she could really win this battle. But then she remembered why she was here. She remembered Nathaniel, the fragile boy who had started to heal under her care. She remembered the bond she had with him, and how far she had come to protect him. When it was her turn to speak, Ava stood tall, her voice steady as she addressed the court. "I am not a thief," she said firmly. "I've done everything in my power to help this family. I've been nothing but honest, and I've worked hard to earn the trust of everyone here. But the truth is, someone else has been using this house as their personal hiding place." She turned to face the gallery, her gaze landing on Adriana. "I've uncovered proof that Marina has been stealing from this house for months. I've seen her taking items, hiding them in her room, and sneaking around the house. I have the evidence to prove it." A murmur ran through the courtroom as Ava's lawyer presented the damning evidence. Surveillance footage from hidden cameras, photographs of the stolen items, and testimonies from the staff who had witnessed Marina's actions. It was clear that Marina had been the one orchestrating the thefts all along, using Ava as her scapegoat to cover her tracks. Adriana's face turned pale as the truth came to light. She had been caught in her own web of lies. Her smug expression faltered as the evidence piled up against her. It was no longer about Ava's innocence. It was about Adriana's guilt. In the end, the truth prevailed. The jury deliberated for only a short time before returning with a verdict. Ava was exonerated, and Marina's crimes were fully exposed. Adriana, however, wasn't so lucky. Her manipulations had finally caught up with her, and the court ruled in Ava's favor. As the gavel came down, Adriana's face twisted with fury and disbelief. The victory was bittersweet. Ava had won, but she knew that this was only the beginning. The battle for her place in this family wasn't over yet. As she left the courtroom with Alexander by her side, she felt a surge of relief. One enemy had been defeated, but there were still many obstacles ahead. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of triumph. She had faced down the storm, and she had come out victorious. The days following the trial were a mix of emotions. The weight that had hung over the mansion for so long was finally lifted. Ava had been exonerated, and Marina's deceit was exposed for all to see. But there was still a sense of lingering tension, especially between Ava and Adriana. Though the court case was over, Ava knew that Adriana would never forgive her for winning. Ava had proven her loyalty to the Whitman family, but it wasn't just about winning the legal battle. It was about something deeper, a connection that had grown between her and Nathaniel. Over the past few months, she had become more than just his caregiver. She had become his protector, his confidant, and his friend. Nathaniel had blossomed under her care, his anxiety and fear beginning to fade away as he found comfort in her presence. For the first time in years, Nathaniel was beginning to smile again. His eyes no longer carried the weight of the world, and his laughter was more frequent, his voice full of joy. Ava had helped him heal not just physically but emotionally. It was a bond that could never be broken. As for Alexander, his feelings for Ava had deepened in ways he hadn't expected. He had seen the strength in her, the courage to fight for what was right, and the compassion to care for his son when no one else could. He had watched her navigate the turmoil of the past few months with grace, and he knew that he had found someone truly special. It wasn't long before Alexander made his feelings known. One evening, as they sat in the garden, watching the sunset, he turned to her with a soft smile. "Ava," he said, his voice filled with warmth, "I want you to know how much you mean to me. You've done more for my family than I could ever repay. You've been there for Nathaniel when no one else was. And I've come to realize, I don't want to imagine my life without you." Ava's heart skipped a beat. She had known this moment would come, but hearing it from him still took her by surprise. She had always tried to keep her distance, afraid of what would happen if she allowed herself to get too close. But in that moment, with the sun setting in the distance and the promise of a new chapter ahead, she knew she was ready to take that step. "I feel the same way," she whispered, her voice barely audible. In that quiet moment, everything seemed to fall into place. The battles they had fought, the trials they had endured, had brought them to this point. A new beginning was on the horizon, one filled with hope, love, and the promise of a future together. And as the stars began to twinkle in the sky, Ava knew that this was only the beginning of her story. One she had fought for, one she had earned, and one she would cherish for the rest of her life. As time passed, the Whitman family continued to heal, their bond stronger than ever. Ava, once a stranger in a storm, had become an inseparable part of their lives. Nathaniel, the boy who had once been consumed by fear and sorrow, was now thriving. His laughter echoed through the halls of the mansion, a sound that had been absent for far too long. Ava and Alexander's relationship blossomed, not just as partners in the face of adversity, but as a family. The love between them grew deeper each day, grounded in trust, understanding, and shared experiences. Together, they built a future that neither had imagined possible in those dark moments of uncertainty. Ava never forgot the journey that had brought her here. The road had been long and fraught with challenges, but it had also been filled with moments of profound change. She had started as a caregiver, a stranger with nothing but a desire to help, but now she was more. She was a mother, a partner, and a woman who had found her place in a world she once thought was beyond her reach. And for Nathaniel, the boy who had taught her the true meaning of strength, she was no longer just a caretaker. She was the one who had given him the courage to embrace life once again, to believe that love and hope were not just things of the past, but the very foundation of his future. As the seasons changed, the mansion that had once been filled with tension and suspicion was now a home, a place of warmth, love, and belonging. Ava stood on the balcony one evening, watching the sunset with Alexander by her side and Nathaniel playing nearby. The storm had passed, and the future stretched before them, a future they would build together, hand in hand. In that moment, Ava realized that life, in all its unpredictability, had a way of surprising us. The person we are meant to be may not always be the one we envision in the beginning, but with courage, love, and the strength to persevere, we can find our way to the life we were always meant to live. And as the last light of day faded into the horizon, Ava knew that this new chapter, this new dawn, was just the beginning of a beautiful story. A story of redemption, love, and the power of family. We truly appreciate you taking the time to join us on this incredible journey. We hope you enjoyed the story and that it touched your heart as much as it did ours. Your support means the world, and we couldn't have reached this point without you. If you loved the story, please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more exciting content. Your likes, shares, and subscriptions help us bring you more stories like this and keep the adventure going. Feel free to leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, thank you again for being a part of our story. Stay tuned for more, and have an amazing day. Like, subscribe, and share.